Welcome to the Dynamic Leadership Live series. This month, in March, we are illustrating how dynamic leadership applies in leadership of one to many. In January, we talked about the individual. In February, we talked about one-to-one leadership for that frontline leader working with teams. And even though it's a team, it's still a one-to-one relationship that drives high performance. In March, we're now talking about one to many, which is the executive leadership, setting the climate. And this applies whether you're in a large organization or a small organization. Somebody has to have that role of setting the climate, even if there's only 3 or 4 people in the organization. And yesterday we talked about adding leadership teams, which may look like a general manager at first. It may look like an office manager at first. But somebody in that organization is going to take on this role, this executive role, to keep the organization's climate productive and aligned with the vision. As organizations grow, leadership stops being primarily about decisions and starts becoming about conditions. Early in a company's life, results are driven by effort, expertise, and direct involvement. But as complexity increases, outcomes depend less on what leaders personally do and more on how well the organization itself responds to uncertainty, pressure, change, and of course, innovation, which should precede those others. While you can't eliminate the others, you can certainly innovate and have a culture of innovation, which, guess what? When you have that culture of innovation, crisis seem like just normal course of operations because you're already used to filling gaps. You're already used to closing gaps, using problem-solving skills, using project leadership. Most leadership models focus on strategy, communication, or execution. Those matter, but they occur after something more fundamental has already taken place. Before action happens, people interpret situations, regulate reactions, and decide how to respond. This is what we talk about in the individual side as well as the manager side, that frontline side, because we have to be able to regulate ourselves. And as leaders, we have to be able to create environments that enable others to regulate. We can't make them regulate, but we can create an environment that prevents them from being triggered unnecessarily and also helps them stay coherent. Now, often this happens in fractions of a second at the individual level. This is why there's so much leverage for leaders by moving upstream. At the individual level, performance improves when a person learns to stabilize themselves before acting. And this can take on a stabilization view of rapid recovery. Rapid recovery is happening so fast that it looks like the person is stable. The same principle applies at scale. Today, I want to introduce an organizational view of the 7-step reset, not as a personal development model, but as a leadership architecture. Executives are not simply responsible for results. They are responsible for creating the conditions that allow coherent action to emerge across the organization. When capability is clear, when environments support presence rather than reactivity, and when leaders can hold productive tension long enough for better decisions to form, organizations become adaptive instead of fragile. Performance stops depending on heroics and begins compounding through alignment. So one thing that's consistent with dynamic leadership is we're moving towards a prevention. And as I've talked many times, prevention in the context of this work isn't necessarily prevention because you're not preventing a thing from happening. You're catching it so early that you're able to adjust the trajectory so that it's aligned with your vision, purpose, intent, or goals, objectives, etc. And that's the same way the word dynamic is used with dynamic traction control, dynamic anti-lock braking systems, dynamic suspension. In dynamic suspension, it may feel like the suspension system is predicting the road surface, but it's not. It's just intervening so early that it sets the damping based on how fast the wheels are moving up and down from the rough road surface. It's happening at the millisecond level, so for the driver, passengers, they don't notice that. They just notice a smooth ride, whether it's a bumpy road, smooth road, or rather aggressive driving on a bumpy road. It maintains that traction. And that's similar to how dynamic leadership works. We're moving so early into the system that we're able to make adjustments to the trajectory before that shift is actually visible. That's because we're doing it at the nervous system level, not the conscious mind level. So the objective is not perfect control. The objective is organizational coherence, the ability to remain aligned, adaptive, and effective even when circumstances are uncertain. What we'll explore today is how the same principles that stabilize individual performance can be applied to leadership itself, allowing organizations to scale clarity, judgment, and resilience together. One way to think about the executive role is through the relationship between coach and player. The coach provides clear structure and boundaries so players can perform as the best version of themselves while granting enough autonomy for instinct and judgment to emerge whenever the moment demands it, regardless of what's going on. Aligned with that view, as I go through this today, there are 3 things I would like you to keep in mind. First, organizations are likely to react before they decide, similar to individuals. Performance problems often begin in interpretation, not execution. Second, leadership scales regulation, not control. Executives shape how the system responds under pressure, and that is highly dependent on how well they self-regulate. The leader. If the leader has trouble self-regulating, then their solutions will not be aligned with moving towards coherence. Third, coherence beats intensity. Aligned organizations outperform reactive ones even with imperfect plans. So that's the backdrop for what we're doing with one-to-many. And as you can see, there's a theme from the individual to the frontline leader to the executive leader, and that's because much of this is fractal. The same way that whether it's Dale Carnegie's book from the 1930s, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People from the 80s, Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs, whatever it is we're talking about, this consistency, because we're still talking, it's all coming back to human needs. And while people may think that, well, that book was written 50 years ago, I don't need it, well, consider this. The hunter-gatherer, which is how the brain is developed. When you look at neuroscience, it makes so much more sense when you look at it through the lens of the hunter-gatherer, what was needed, because that was the evolution. And whether it's 10,000 or 100,000 years as hunter-gatherers, we spent a heck of a lot more time in that role than we have in this current role where we have technology and instant gratification and industrial versus agriculture. So that's why we have to look sometimes to what's endured and what has been consistent, because that has the clues of what actually works. And so one of the things I'll be doing with the dynamic leadership work is talking about frameworks, because frameworks help us both set coherence and maintain stability before something happens, and frameworks also help us deal with it. Let's say that there's a crisis. By using frameworks, we're keeping the organization in this nice steady state, this stabilized state. When I talk about steady state, you've heard me talk about allostasis. We're talking about growing, not status quo horizontal. But regardless, when you can have coherence and presence in an organization, you're more able to absorb the crisis that's coming, process it, and have a good action. So frameworks, and I'll talk about one of them today, but throughout the month I'll introduce them as I reinforce and build on the concepts we're talking about today. They help before the stimulus by helping with the coherence, but they also help after the stimulus, because if it's a crisis, for example, you don't want people reacting. You don't want people feeling like the house is on fire, it's all going to burn down. We want to get them into a coherent state, even in the moment. And this is that rapid recovery, modulating emotions, making sure that folks are regulated before they make decisions rather than the other way around. And then at the end of it all, it's coming back to that coherence. So we'll talk about that today. But first, I want to make a couple of illustrations. In the 7-step reset, we have 1 is your knowledge, 2 is your state, 3 is your stimulus and your conditioned reaction, 4 is your response, 5 is emotional modulation if needed, 6 is action, and 7 is return to mindfulness. This is your presence. And you see it actually spells scream when you look at it like that. Now, what we're talking about with the executive role is 2 is 1 and 2. And 7. In looking at it this way, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So we can't control the stimulus. Things are going to happen and there's nothing you can do about it. You can influence how people respond. The reaction tends to be the reaction, but you can handle how they respond with training and development and practice. And I like the idea, well, I'm against manufacturing crisis, so people have to do something. I am very much in favor of innovating and skunk works and doing constant skunk work. Some organizations, they say that they want people to spend 20% of their time working on a new project. That's aligned with that, because when you're innovating, you're going through the process of problem solving skills and project leadership and iterating through solutions and measurement and coming back to it and making adjustments and learning to have that resilience that's required to have an iterative development and iterative refinement environment. And then, of course, emotional modulation, that gets better with time and the actions become better. And we have the frameworks and models that I'll be talking about help here, and it helps stabilize here, as I've mentioned. In leadership, under knowledge, whereas in the individual I talk about neuroplasticity, beliefs, priming, mindset, and physiology. We have to understand that and apply it. In leadership, we may have things like initiative, point of view. And what I mean here is sometimes when people are promoted, let's say a person comes up through in an organization where yes people are rewarded. They may learn to not have a point of view. They may learn, just like an A student in school, where they regurgitate what the professor gave them. They may learn that what they have to do is say what the boss wants, and they have shut down their ability to have a point of view. I've run into people as in mentoring who just could not express a point of view. I had to create such a safe environment for them to have a point of view. And so my work shifted from straight mentoring to making sure that people found their voice, because I could get them to do all the right things, but if they didn't have a voice, these folks wouldn't speak up. So those are some examples of what happens during the leadership piece. And then in step 2, where we talk about what state are they in, this is where we want coherence. From the leadership standpoint, we're making sure that people are present and coherent. More the environment, right? The environment is conducive to presence and coherence. And then in 7, it's returning. It's getting back to that coherence. And this is all necessary for high performance. And we could list a myriad of things under the knowledge, and this gets to the development plans. I've talked about for all employees, but managers, leaders, that we should have 2-year development plans for every role. And while those 2-year development plans may only be 2 touch points for an experienced executive, perhaps, but for frontline employees straight out of college, there may be 8 touch points across that 2 years. And in that, and these are the things where we make sure that they understand and know how to apply initiative, that they know how to have a formulate and have a point of view. They know how to do analysis. That would be another one, the way the company wants. One I mentioned yesterday is problem solving. They should all be using, in an organization, everyone should be using the same problem solving model. And I did a diagram that showed how you can move from autonomy and how autonomy is enabled by having structure. And through that structure, people are able to have freedom of action. And I used the example in the introduction about the coach who, yes, they have plays, they have a playbook, and they have plays, and they're calling plays based on what they're seeing. But they never take the autonomy from that running back. And even the quarterback who has to take plays from the coach, they still have the autonomy to make a decision depending on what they see. And that's the power of having this blend of of structure, but also autonomy to execute based on what you're seeing. But in order for that autonomy to work at its best, people need to have reps on the skills. This is why I like to have innovation that's constantly going on. And there's always reasons to have skunkworks. You can go, if you think about the Ansoff matrix, existing markets with new products and services, and you have existing products and services to new markets. You can have both of those going on all the time and use that to guide your skunk work. And the skunk works will help people learn how to deal with this project leadership, which is a skill and one that's not, I would say, is unrepresented in highly capable organizations because there's so much emphasis on operations. Operations excellence, yeah, no question about it. But when it comes to time to creating a project, and this is why a lot of your organizations will hire consultant companies to come in to manage the project because the operational people don't have those skills. And I may be generalizing, but I encourage everyone to look at their own organization and make some decisions as to what it looks like for them. All right, now I've spoken a few times about the alignment of dynamic leadership and emotional intelligence. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on emotional intelligence. I just like to make the point that this is not competing with emotional intelligence. It's taking all the goodness and good work that came out around emotional intelligence and moving upstream to where we can do things at the subconscious level, because there is an awareness of it internally. It may be physiological, that awareness, but that's when we can actually act on it. And this is how we smooth out the rapid recovery and make it look like stability. And so these 4 pillars still apply, and they are embedded into dynamic leadership. And so whatever you've learned in emotional intelligence still applies. Just think about it as when we talk about regulation is talked about a lot in emotional intelligence. I'm looking at regulation in 3 sectors. One is prevention or near prevention. One is modulation, so while it's happening, and then one is after. I would argue that much of emotional intelligence is geared towards after it happens, because the premise during the time, and rightly so, because we didn't have the brain scanning tools to know what was really going on, and the subconscious was thought of as a mind, most of the corrective action or most of the regulation is actually corrective action in emotional intelligence. Again, not throwing stones over there, but the point is, if you think of things like getting telling tension as an individual, or maybe someone's speaking and you want to react, or let's say you are the speaker or the leader, and you say something and somebody reacts with some telling tension, or you can see that their face changes. This is well before conscious awareness, or earlier than conscious awareness. And that's the opportunity when the leader can say something like, I want to pause here and see what's coming up for people. So what are you reacting to? And if you don't get anything, you may throw something out. For example, I've heard that, blah, blah, blah. And now people can talk. So that signal didn't tell you that something was going on. It could have been that it reminded them of something that happened 5 years ago in their family, and they're not even going to bring it up. But you want to make sure you open that space for them to bring it up if what you said reminds them of something that led to them losing their job in the past, right? You don't know that, but by asking those questions, you can smoke some of it out. In the same way, we feel our own telling tension. So when that first comes up, this is when we want to regulate quickly, because one of the things as the leader that you're recognizing is that what's coming up could be something that's totally unrelated, and probably is, and it's worth them talking about it to process it so you can correct it, because the longer it festers and sits there, then it becomes a conscious thought. And once it becomes a conscious thought, it's then a narrative that needs defending, and then it becomes identity. By catching it in the seconds level versus minutes and hours, you're able to redirect the trajectory by clarifying. That's the role of the leader. As an individual, when you feel it coming up, it's a good time to maybe take a breath, and recenter. Take that deep breath. I've talked about anchors. I've talked about changing your attention, maybe looking somewhere else. And because you're reminding yourself, that's an association from the past. It doesn't have a place here. We can revisit it later, but this is not that. I've used the example, of somebody who's going through a traumatic situation and there's sunflower plants all around them, and they could be walking down a path years later, and they come across these sunflower plants, and all of a sudden they're back into that state, and the person they're with did nothing at all, but yet they're angry at the person who they're with because those sunflowers reminded them as an anchor of what went on before. This is the power of associations, and this is why dynamic leadership exists. It's because too often we're responding to reactions that are based on associations from the past. And what we have to do is move that upstream so we're recognizing, surfacing, and modulating them along the way. You can't wait till after the fact because then you're working on the wrong thing. And then the person describes why they feel a certain way, and they're making it up. Not making it up, but they're backing into it because that feeling, that concern, became a narrative and then became identity, and now they've restated it in such a way that it's sanitized, but they're presenting it as though it's fact. The other thing that happens is people will continue to go down this path to the point where they'll change the facts to align with the feelings. So we have to constantly be going back and understanding where it's coming from. And this is why frameworks work that I'll be talking about during this month. And then we have the self-determination theory, and this is core to intrinsic motivation. We all want intrinsic motivation, and intrinsic motivation is getting pleasure from the activity itself. So you don't need the external. I'm not saying anything against extrinsic motivation. It all works. But intrinsic motivation means there's high performance even when the boss is not watching. And we talk about blue, red, and white language in the earlier segments when I was talking about one-to-one leadership. We'll bring that up again in March, but that's a strong way of driving some of this intrinsic motivation because you're using the system's way of working with dopamine and serotonin to connect some dots. Now, this is what we talked about earlier. We always start with purpose when I'm working with an individual, and let's make sure that we're doing the things that we can control, our agency, which is mental, physical, spiritual, and then emotional is in the middle. So we have to make sure we're in command of those things we control. That's the agency and personal leadership. And then we have relationship, professional, and financial, which is the outcomes that we want. But these involve other people. So we have to be straight here so that we're not knocked off course over here. This is the be, do, have model. And then we have the 7-step reset. I talked here about beliefs, neuroplasticity, priming, mindset, and physiology, and then state of being, or state, mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, also your self-image, your self-talk, what's going on there. Here's the stimulus and reaction, and then here's your response, and we want to make sure they're separate. We don't want the response to equal the reaction because the reaction is usually part of associations or triggered as part by associations from the past, and you can have the subconscious, the way it is, network of neurons, it thinks of threats as a tiger on the Serengeti. So the overreactions are very common. Then we have emotional modulation, and this is the point about you can prevent it, which is we do over here, but you're not going to prevent all of it. And when something slips through, then we have to modulate the emotion real time. You have about 90 seconds to modulate it real time. And if you don't catch it in that 90 seconds, it starts becoming a neurobiological event, which now it's locked in, at least more so than if you catch it early. And then we have action, because we don't want to be taking action if we're emotionally triggered, and we have return to mindfulness. So this is the 7-step reset. This is happening thousands of times a day, 30,000 stimulus response cycles a day, and probably more in a lot of cases, like right now in the US when people are walking around in a kind of a triggered state. And then we have the 7 phases of the 1-second model. So this is 1 second, and the first 600 milliseconds is where you have that extra power, because the first half second plus the 100 milliseconds pre-listening, there's so much processing capacity happening here. 11 million bits per second versus the conscious mind, which is 50 bits per second. So the more we move actions and intervention this way, the more we're going to leverage the power and speed of the subconscious. And that's how that works. Now, before I go further, I want to just illustrate a framework, what I was talking about. Now, we went through this model here, and you'll see that's the 7-step reset, right? That's the, instead of what I showed you, it's the knowledge, it's the state, stimulus response, and then stimulus reaction, stimulus conditioned reaction, then reaction, emotional modulation, action, and return to mindfulness. I said that it spells SCREAM as a way to remember that from the 3 to 7. And a model or framework example that we'll be using as we go through this is RACI. And I think that when I talk about development plans, it may be, what development plans? What do they need? Well, think about it. There should be a set amount of terminology. It doesn't mean this terminology is better than that terminology. It doesn't mean that this approach to leadership is better than that approach to leadership. It just means that this is the approach that we decided. Otherwise, you can have leaders operating out of a family metaphor, somebody else is in a political metaphor, someone else is in a command metaphor, someone else is in a democratic metaphor, then you have friend groups, all this kind of stuff coming up. But the leader, the owner, CEO should be saying this is the way we're going to lead. So that's what fills your development plan. You don't have to work too hard to come up with the development plan. What's my terminology? What's my common language? What are the behaviors that I want to see? That's the initiative and having a point of view and using problem solving model versus just jumping to conclusions. But this one is one I think everybody can adapt to their approach without changing anything. So it's RACI. Who's responsible? And this makes a good distinction because you also have who's accountable. So this person is closer to the work, but this person has to be engaged because they're accountable. Who's consulted, and then who's informed. So by applying this RACI model, the next time you introduce something, and you can apply it operationally as well, but the next time you have a project or a shift, you make sure you identify who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, and who's informed. And if you're a small organization, responsible and accountable may be the same person. Consulted and informed may be the same person, but you get the idea. You can apply this anywhere, and what this does is it starts moving towards autonomy, and it starts surfacing competence, and it allows relatedness because there's a natural conversation flow that happens in both directions. That's one example of a framework. Another example I like to use is 2-axis frameworks, growth, for example, and profit. Again, that's one that any organization can apply right now today. And this will simplify your decision-making conversations. When the conversation starts getting off the rails or starts getting too complex, you can always bring this out to kind of make it practical and start making some decisions. And by the way, guess what? In your development planning, you're going to let people know that profit and growth are both important. But when it comes to one or the other, we're going with profit. This enables you to have profitable growth. The salespeople coming to visit your organization, they're going to be focused on growth. You want to have gates in place so that you make sure you add the profit in there too. We don't want to just keep chasing growth because while it may seem good when there's a crisis, when there's a major threat like the pandemic, the people who are focusing on growth, there's not enough profit to sustain them for that cycle to end. Same thing happened in 2008, which is when some of the good to great companies who were doing very, very well, but they didn't have fat enough balance sheets to withstand what was going on with that crisis. So that now pulls in back to where we were. We have, as I was saying, the purpose in this case. This is the leaders, the executive role, the 7 steps. This is 7 steps for executive leadership. And then the 1-second model, you still have that to deal with, but by setting the stage up front, you have less risk here because you've already framed it, you've already set the coherence, etc. All right, now, the 7-step reset, recovery as a performance multiplier. The 7-step reset absorbs the 33,000 stimulus response cycles with automaticity. That's the power of it. It's making it automatic because it's earlier and it's working at the network of neurons level, aka subconscious. Interrupts the pattern, returns to presence, restores coherence, and then emotional modulation before escalation. So this is the same thing that you're doing at a scaled up version as executives. From principle to practice, leadership is not the application of tools, but the creation of conditions where the right actions become obvious. You don't want to have to debate what the right action is. You want it to be so clear because of how you're running the organization. That gets back to the development plans, introducing the terminology, making sure people have the skills, the capabilities. So this is the graphic of what I was describing. Over here with attention, you have where we're going to put our attention. On our circle of influence, this is what we can control. This is just like the 7 performance series. We focus first on what we can control, where we have agency, and then we start moving into the other areas as this grows. And the circle of influence will grow, and your circle of concern will probably grow, but your capability to deal with what's in that circle of concern. So the relationship between these two, you should see the circle of concern growing faster than, the circle of influence growing faster than the circle of concern. I also talked yesterday about purpose and orientation. And you want to pick where are we going? What's our direction? And in doing so, you also decide this is out of scope. It's easy to do as an organization. These are the things we are not going to do. We are not going to become the low-cost provider. There can only be one lowest cost provider. So why are we going to compete when there's only one spot? But when you focus on being a premium provider, you have different options to go. So this is completely out of scope, and this becomes somewhat discretionary, but I would say from here down, we're probably not going to do that. We may look at it next year, and from here up, that is, you could call discretionary. In the drawing, I also said that if you think about a cone of about 60 degrees, and a 60-degree cone, if this was a clock face, would be 11 o'clock to 1 o'clock. That cone is your focus. This is where we're going to focus. But we keep moving up because you don't want it to get wider and wider and wider. But we're going to keep moving up. But this is the idea. You want to have purpose and orientation, and we use that the way we use purpose. When I talk with an individual, we start with purpose. We start with an organization, you have to start with purpose, vision, mission, something like that. And then we have intention. When you start an innovation, when you're responding to a crisis, when you're making a shift in the organization, we want to make sure we identify what are we doing, why are we doing it, who benefits, what's in scope, what's out of scope, what are the guiding principles, and what's the output. We want to make sure that we go through these and articulate them, because that becomes your North Star, and it guides behaviors when decisions have to be made on the fly. It's why the players on the field can have the autonomy to make those quick actions, because they know what the direction is. They want to win the game, right? And they know what to do. They're responding based on the conditions. This is why players have to know the rules of the game. And you see it happen every season. There's at least one game where a player knew the rules so well that they made everybody wonder, wow, what was he doing? But he was taking advantage of a rule. All right, executive leadership and organizational coherence. The executive role is to apply the same regulation principles that govern individual performance to the organization itself. So it's fractal. This is why we started where we did, and we're going to go to here. And it's why it helps to understand the 7 phases of the 1-second model and the 7-step reset. Ensure capability exists before pressure arrives. This is where you practice with innovation or prepare. Sustain coherence during uncertainty. This is a skill that you have to have. You've got to create this skill, and remember, it's by quickly addressing it, not by letting it fester. The longer you let it fester, the bigger the amplitude on the spikes. Hold productive tension long enough for better decisions. This is an important one. When we're thinking about that step 2, this is where we're getting into the right state. And then when the stimulus condition reaction happens, before action occurs, there's this point that we want to maintain as leaders in an organization where we hold tension. We want to get more input. It's so easy for the loudest, most persuasive person to come out and say, we need to do this to fix it, and everybody jumps on. Then you have groupthink. But that leader has to hold attention until they gather more information. I used to describe it as circling the field in a plane before you land. But when you look at it as holding that tension, it puts a picture on it as to what that leader needs to bring to the table. And every crisis or issue or problem doesn't have to be resolved in a moment. Some of them you can have weeks to resolve it. So why rush? Just like Einstein said, if he had an hour to solve a problem, he'd spend 55 minutes talking about the problem and defining it, and only 5 minutes solving it. So productive tension, long enough for better decisions. Restore alignment so that learning compounds. Leadership effectiveness is determined less by decisions made and more by conditions created. So it's not just the decision, it's what's the condition that I'm creating to make that decision most likely to be the right one. Prepare capability and create presence. So this would be steps 1 and 2. This is making sure that they have the knowledge and making sure that they have the skills and that they're able to stay in that right state. Performance improves when organizations are prepared before challenges appear. Equip teams with knowledge, clarity, and decision context. And you can start looking at these slides and thinking about what do we need in our development plan. Start small, start with 1 or 2 things. Everybody should know how to use a RACI model. Everybody should know how to use at least 2 or 3 2-axis matrices: growth and profit, speed and accuracy, and customer versus production, something like that. Align expectations and operating principles. Model calm and stability during ambiguity. In emotional intelligence, they talk a lot about the executives, the leaders, making sure they can regulate themselves because they can inject noise into the system, and that only creates problems. Build environments where presence is normal, not situational. So presence becomes the norm. Preparation reduces reactivity and expands intelligent autonomy. Productive tension, steps 3 to 6. So this is the stimulus, reaction, the response, modulation, and action. Great leadership does not eliminate pressure, it regulates response to it. This is that holding tension during that period. Delay premature certainty. And this is huge because once people state it and they agree to it, like I said, then it becomes narrative, and then soon after that it becomes something they defend, and then it's identity. And now they're fighting for it like they're fighting for their favorite sports team. And then you get this fan behavior. Separate stimulus from reaction and reaction from response. Encourage thoughtful response over immediate action, and allow learning and interpretation before commitment. So this is that circling, that holding attention to bring people on. The other thing bringing that holding tension does, it allows people to get over that initial reaction, and they get to go home and sleep on it and realize this is not equal to that. Innovation and sound judgment emerge when tension is held rather than collapsed. And then return to organizational coherence. That's step 7. So you can see this tracks right along with the 7-step reset. And once you've experienced it yourself and you've recognized how moving upstream works so well in the 7-step reset and the 7 phases with the 1-second model, and I think of that, just to collapse it, as the first 600 milliseconds. You see how that works, and then you start applying it in the organization, and it becomes self-reinforcing because you recognize that it works. Every cycle of action must end with stabilization and integration. One of the things we recommend is an after-action report, or post-mortem, it's also called. You go through and you just look at what's going on. This allows people to not carry that noise and pain, because there may have been some feelings hurt. People may have felt like they really screwed up in the organization, and this is a chance to convert some of that anxiety into, this was goodness. We learned a lot. We made an investment in this team because they've gone through this, and now that team is more capable of doing something else. That post-mortem can serve to do that. So reflect and integrate learning, restore clarity of direction, reinforce shared understanding, and reset emotional and operational alignment. So again, you can see how using these slides, you can start thinking about the development plans for your organization. What do you want people to have? What are the skills that they need to have? Leaders should be able to take a post-mortem and not only see what they learned from it, but use it to strengthen the organization aligned with that purpose and intention. So recovery transforms experience into capability and prevents accumulated friction. And then the leadership at scale. So executives do not manage activity, they regulate the conditions that produce performance. And this is motherhood and apple pie, we know this, but what I'm doing is putting it in the context of this dynamic leadership, which is all about moving upstream. At the lower levels, we're moving upstream temporally, for time. We're moving from the stimulus response, we're moving to influence the trajectory of the reaction before the response happens. But when you get into executive leadership, yes, we begin by moving upstream using time, but then you shift and you start moving upstream based on meaning, purpose, the vision, right? So that upstream towards meaning is even further along, because now we've narrowed, with that conversation about what's in scope, what's out of scope, guiding principles, we've narrowed what the possible responses are. And by doing so, you're eliminating potential noise, potential threats, potential risks. This is good to great, simple, methodical, and consistent. Get the right people on the bus. Level 5 leadership. The hedgehog concept. It's all aligned with this content. When coherence becomes systemic, performance stops depending on individuals and begins compounding through the organization. And that's the goal of one to many. We want to move that upstream both in time but also in meaning, and having it in such a way with the right development, managing a coherent organization in that kind of environment, and people having the right skills and the autonomy to take action on those emerging situations that occur when they're on the front line. And that's what we can do in the organization. That's why I say 2-year development plans, because you keep cycling this through, and if a person stays in the same position after 2 years, they can have another 2 years development plan. But the 2-year development also aligns with how frequently people get promoted after 2 years, give or take a few months. Not always, but I'm just saying position changes tend to happen after 2 years. Enough checkpoints have gone through, review cycles, and the organization has moved along. And if you're a growing organization, you need more positions. And then there's the 7-step reset, just as a recap. That's for the individual. I'll put one in here that will apply to the leader. And all of this supports moving above the line. When individuals, organizations, teams move from their comfort zone to above the line, there's a barrier in place, and that barrier has to do with, it's the inertia. It's all the things that have kept them below the line. With individuals, it's habit patterns. It's things that they heard as a kid. It's getting bullied. It's losing. It's maybe such good experiences that they're not willing to try anything else. So this barrier exists for individuals. It exists for small teams. It exists for organizations. And we have to understand that as you cross this barrier, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance. And this is why we need the 7-step reset. This is why we need the organizational coherence, because the way you get past that cognitive dissonance is by having frameworks and models so people put it in its right place, and it's not tapping into associations from the past. And that's what's depicted here. We're always going to run into this. And then once you're here, so this is like the good to great companies. They had an inflection point, and then for at least 15 years, they were outperforming all the others. And a few companies made the good to great. 2008 crisis, some fell off, and then they kept the ones that did, and they said, this is great by choice. So now you have, how do you go from good to great? And then how do you stay and be great by choice? And that's where we have a consistent way of applying this. So we use principles instead of conditioning to guide our direction. And that's just more of the similar slide, but we got the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, and that shows up with opportunities and threats. So we don't want to be chasing shiny things. We're focused on our vision. So I'll be going live each week. Thursdays usually have a workshop, and then Wednesdays is the Ask Me Anything. Monday, Tuesday, Friday, I'm live on different channels. Fridays will typically be on LinkedIn. The other days on Facebook and YouTube. And the reason I'm doing this is because I want to make it actionable and I want to make it practical. And by showing how it's fractal, how it applies at the individual level, how it applies at the middle level, and how it applies at the executive level, and that the thing that's consistent is we're moving upstream, whether upstream time or upstream meaning, and both. And by moving upstream, we're able to go from high effort, low impact to low effort, high impact. Because the further upstream you move, the less deviation you have to correct. But also, in the case of the individual, you have the power of and the speed of the network of neurons. as the executive what you're doing by moving upstream, both time and meaning, and let's call it orientation, time and orientation. You're creating an environment where people are less likely to be triggered. If people are less likely to be triggered, that means there's less fight or flight. If there's less fight or flight, there's automatically going to be more coherence. And what we're doing is creating an environment that fosters more coherence. And you can see how this turns into, when done right, a high-performance organization. So in March, I'll be continuing with this theme. I'll introduce more frameworks, and we'll reinforce this message along the way, giving different lenses, different ways to look at it. And we'll finish up with March, and depending on interest, in April, we'll start working on innovation to literally help people do some innovation and getting that practice around innovating on skunk work type stuff that I don't want to say it doesn't really matter, but you're not reacting to something pressing from the outside. You're responding to an opportunity that you see as an organization. So that's what we'll do. So, all right, we'll see you tomorrow. We got the Ask Me Anything, 7 a.m. Pacific time, Wednesday tomorrow.